If you are an American citizen who does not want to ashcan the American system of government, who doesn't want a strongman authoritarian system where the whole government is one guy and everything else just exists to serve him, if that is not the kind of country that you want, then yesterday's election means you have more to do for your country than you have ever done before. Because now is when the rubber really hits the road, right? We don't just flip a switch and the American system of government is gone. Democracy is gone. It doesn't work like that. I mean, not to be boring here for a second, but just getting very real. We now are just another one in the list of countries that has decided to, hey, what the heck? Let's try the strongman thing. Let's let democracy go. Let's put in an all-powerful guy instead, see how it goes. There are many more countries in the world governed by that kind of a system than there are governed by ours. We are the only 248-year-old multiracial, pluralistic democracy in the world. And shall we keep it? A lot of our fellow Americans say we shouldn't. Now we know. Now we know for sure. But a lot of Americans, tens of millions of Americans, say we should keep that system, which means time to fight for it. And yes, Americans did fight for it by working on this election, by trying to get the candidate elected who was both the Democrat and the small d Democrat. She didn't win. The strongman candidate won instead. But now history doesn't end. Time doesn't stop. Now we have the benefit of knowing, how this has gone in every other country that has been through a democracy to authoritarian transition. And sadly, there are a lot of them. We have the benefit of seeing what's happened in those other countries, though. And what we know is that the more ground the authoritarian takes, the harder it is to ever get that ground back. And so the first order of business is to stop them from taking any uncontested ground right from the outset when it comes to what our system of government is and what our democracy is. Right? We know from other countries' experiences that quickly, I mean now, in the next few weeks, if not the next few days, they are going to start pushing to see how far the country is going to let them go without pushback, without protest. And part of this is because it's just psychologically advantageous for them to do this now, right? They're counting on the half the country that voted against them, the half the country that doesn't want to give up our system of government. They're counting on all those tens of millions of Americans to be despondent, to feel powerless, to check out, which, of course, would mean letting them do what they want, letting them run the table. What they really don't want is for the half the country that voted against them, the half the country that wants to keep our democracy. What they really don't want is for those tens of millions of Americans to wake up tomorrow feeling scrappy as hell, feeling, sure, regretful about the election outcome, but also, frankly, freed up from having to spend all of our time working on the election. So now we can work full time on being fricking pirates, on being a thorn in the side to anyone who now intends to try to turn this country into some tin pot tyranny. What they want least of all is to realize that half the country went to bed sad tonight, but then woke up tomorrow fired up with a new sense of purpose, knowing that apparently this is what we're on this earth to do as American citizens in this generation. Because history did not just end. Time did not just stop. We just got marching orders from the universe and the Electoral College that as of today, American citizens who do want to hold on to democracy, we know exactly what we're going to be spending the next days and weeks and likely years of our life working on. And the strategic first moves come into focus quickly when you think about what other countries have shown us about how hard it is to regain democratic ground once an authoritarian leader has taken that ground. And the work has to be done now. The work that has to be done now, it has to happen in sort of every aspect, every corner of our society. The U.S. military needs to give the American people binding assurances that they will not deploy U.S. military force against the civilian population in this country. They can give those assurances, and now they should. The free press needs to give the people of this country assurances that they will not become state TV.
The election night lights have barely dimmed. America has spoken, and Rachel Maddow, standing in the quiet aftermath, looks straight into the camera with the calm of someone who understands exactly what comes next. Trump has won again, and Maddow doesn't pretend it's business as usual. She takes a breath, looks at the numbers, the maps, the sea of red and blue glowing across the screen, and says something that pierces through the noise. "This isn't the end of democracy," she says. "It's a reminder. We've got a really big to-do list." There's no panic in her voice, no outrage, just resolve. Because for Maddow, Trump's return isn't a shock, it's a challenge, a test of how much America truly values the freedoms it once took for granted. She doesn't sugarcoat it. She reminds viewers that Trump has made his intentions clear, that he's coming for the institutions that limited him before. The Justice Department, the press, the Constitution itself. He's not hiding it. He's promising it. And yet Maddow refuses to surrender to despair. She calls it a wake-up call, the kind that drags a nation out of its comfort and back into its responsibility. Democracy, she says, was never supposed to run on autopilot. It survives only when people defend it, deliberately, constantly, relentlessly. Trump's victory speech plays. He talks about revenge, power, domination, words that echo not like leadership, but like warning shots. Maddow listens, head slightly tilted, then turns back to her viewers and says, "If this is the road we're on, then we have work to do." She outlines what that means, not in slogans, but in action. Protecting the press, guarding the courts, defending election workers, supporting truth when lies are louder and easier to believe. She reminds America that democracy isn't a gift. It's a fight that never ends. And tonight, that fight just got harder. Maddow walks through the numbers again, not to relive defeat, but to expose the cracks. She points to states where voter suppression worked, where misinformation flooded communities, where fear replaced facts. She says it's not about one man winning. It's about a system failing to protect itself. Her words carry weight because they come without theatrics. She's not mourning, she's mobilizing. This isn't about Trump anymore, she says. It's about us. She recalls the lessons of history, the times when democracies fell, not because of coups or wars, but because good people stopped paying attention. Authoritarianism, she says, doesn't arrive in tanks. It arrives in ballots, headlines, and silence. As the broadcast continues, the studio feels tense, the nation's reflection staring back at itself. Maddow shows clips of Trump's allies celebrating, making plans, talking about retribution. Then she contrasts them with images of ordinary Americans, teachers, journalists, veterans, voters, people watching in disbelief but ready to stand guard again. "This is what defending democracy looks like," she says. "It's not waving a flag. It's not a hashtag. It's showing up every day. Even when you're tired, even when you're scared." She talks about journalists already being threatened, about activists preparing for battles in the courts, about educators facing new restrictions. And yet, beneath her concern is something stronger, determination, because Maddow believes democracy's defenders are still out there. Millions of them, quiet, ordinary, but unbreakable. She looks into the camera and says, "If you're angry tonight, good. That means you care. Now let's turn that into something real." The audience knows what she means. Register, organize, speak, protect the truth before it disappears behind a wall of noise. She reminds viewers of how democracies around the world have come back from the brink before, by refusing to normalize corruption, by standing up to propaganda, by believing that truth still matters. "We've done this before," she says. "We can do it again." Then she turns to the real danger, complacency, the belief that institutions will hold on their own. They won't, she warns. They only hold when people hold them up, when journalists keep digging, when citizens keep watching, when no one looks away. Trump's power, she says, depends on exhaustion, on people giving up, tuning out, moving on. But if America stays awake, if it keeps fighting, then his victory will not be the end of democracy. It will be the reason it survives. Maddow plays a montage of moments from the last few years. January 6th, court trials, protests, journalists under attack, not to reopen wounds, but to remind viewers what's at stake. Every one of those moments was a warning. Now, the warning has become reality, yet she insists this isn't a eulogy for democracy. It's a plan, a checklist, a to-do list, as she calls it, written not in despair, but in duty. Defend the vote, defend the truth, defend each other. And she smiles, a small, tired smile, but one that
that they will stand and fight together. They will put aside rivalries and petty professional differences. They will stand and fight together as the free press, as the Fourth Estate, as an institution that is a pillar of our democracy, as these guys on the other side inevitably start picking off individual journalists, individual publishers, individual news organizations to try ultimately to turn us all into some American accented version of RT. If the Democratic Party takes the House, expect Article 1 of the Constitution to come under attack. By which I mean expect efforts to hollow out the power of Congress, to make Congress a just-for-show institution, right? There's a reason actions of the Russian Duma never make news, right? Expect efforts to attack Article 1, to make it a just-for-show institution that has had its real powers taken over by the executive, by the dear leader. We are going to need a plan and some steel spine inserts among elected officials in Washington to head that off. We're going to need the whole country to recognize that risk in advance, to call it what it is when they try it, and to actively resist it. Depending on whether the courts can provide a check on this administration, expect Article 3 of the Constitution to come under attack as well. It is already a fetish and a laugh line on the right to brag about how court orders really mean nothing and physical force and violence is what ultimately really decides what's allowed. Well, we have to decide if that laugh line from them is going to become our reality or whether we're going to resist that. We need a plan and some steel spine inserts among members of the judiciary to head that off. We're going to need the whole country to recognize that risk in advance. We're going to need every lawyer in the country to recognize it as their calling to fight it. We're going to need to call it what it is when it inevitably happens, and we're going to have to actively resist it. And then there's civil society. Is there a more boring term in the world that doesn't include the word committee or budget? No, there isn't. Civil society, though, is kind of where the rest of us are at, right? Civil society is one of the things that I think of as soft food for authoritarians. They often don't even have to bite that hard to crush it. All the organizations, membership groups, advocacy groups, professional associations, every voluntary group of every kind in the country, everything in organized American life and culture that is not business and not the government either, that is civil society. And authoritarians need to crush that because it's not about them. Strongmen leaders have a tendency to become not just leaders of the government, not just dictators, but totalitarians because they can't have anything going on in the country that isn't about them or for them.
The day after her broadcast, the reality of Trump's win sank in deeper. Across the country, people were waking up to a familiar unease, a sense that the work of defending democracy had just begun. Maddow returned to the screen, not to dramatize, but to organize. She outlined the tangible steps citizens, journalists, and institutions needed to take: register voters, monitor elections, support independent media, challenge misinformation wherever it spread. She highlighted the growing threats, both overt and subtle. Local officials under pressure, journalists harassed for reporting the truth, communities flooded with disinformation campaigns, and she reminded viewers that these weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a system Trump had been building for years, yet Maddow framed it not as hopelessness, but as accountability in motion. Every threat exposed, every lie corrected, every person standing up. It all mattered. Democracy, she said, is a living organism. It needs defense, attention, and courage. And the alternative, apathy, even was a gift to authoritarianism. She revisited Trump's rhetoric from the previous night. The boasting, the threats, the promises to punish opponents. Each statement was dissected. Maddow showed how it wasn't just words. They were instructions to followers, blueprints for undermining institutions, attempts to intimidate those who dared resist. But she also revealed cracks. Trump's supporters were divided. Some were eager for chaos, others wary, uncertain, questioning. Every report she shared painted the same picture. The facade facade of control was weaker than it appeared. The man who claimed dominance over America's future was struggling to hold even a fraction of his power. Maddow traced the emerging networks of resistance: nonprofits, journalists, local organizers, whistleblowers, ordinary people stepping up where systems had been tested and threatened. She emphasized that real action didn't need fanfare. Small, consistent, determined efforts could stop larger, more visible threats. She turned to the media landscape itself: newsrooms under pressure, reporters facing harassment, misinformation spreading unchecked. She called on journalists to resist fear, report facts relentlessly, and maintain independence. The truth, she said, is America's best defense against tyranny. Maddow also addressed Congress and government institutions. Checks and balances weren't automatic. They required vigilance. Lawmakers needed to enforce accountability, uphold law, and resist intimidation. She didn't shy away from naming failures or warning of consequences if institutions faltered. Throughout her coverage, she intertwined lessons from history. Other nations had faced leaders who ignored rules, undermined elections, and weaponized fear. The lesson was clear: complacency is the ally of authoritarianism. Action is democracy's lifeblood. And then she addressed the viewers directly, calling for participation. She didn't mean empty gestures or performative activism. She meant sustained engagement, watching government decisions, supporting trustworthy information, voting, and holding officials accountable. Every citizen, she said, has a role, and the sum of small acts can outweigh the power of one man. Maddow also highlighted the judiciary's role. Courts, she reminded, are not immune to pressure, but judges and lawyers who act with integrity can enforce the law and limit overreach. The message was simple: protect institutions, and institutions protect democracy. She revisited the to-do list she had first outlined. It had grown longer, not because Trump had expanded his power, but because Americans were beginning to see their own responsibility. Each item on that list represented a check against corruption, a safeguard for fairness, and a step towards stability. And while the challenges seemed immense, Maddow reminded viewers that democracy's defenders had succeeded before. Through vigilance, courage, and persistence, people had preserved their freedoms against greater odds. Now it was their turn again. She concluded with a note of urgency. Trump's win wasn't an endpoint. It was a reminder that democracy requires work, daily, committed, and unwavering. Every law, every vote, every voice mattered. By the end of the broadcast, the message was clear: America's survival didn't depend on one leader, one party, or one election. It depended on its people. And for the millions listening, watching, and taking notes, Maddow had done what she always does. She transformed fear into purpose, despair into action. The to-do list remained daunting, but it was no longer abstract. It was concrete, a blueprint for citizens determined not to let history repeat itself. And in that blueprint lay hope, because while one man had won the vote, the nation's resilience, its institutions, and its people, guided by truth, courage, and resolve, would ultimately define its future.